Alright YouTube, it's time for the Occult video 87 on hexes, curses, and related sort of black magic diabolical works. It's something that different groups of people have different feelings about. That is, specifically whether or not these things work, or just sort of psychological ritualism, or nonsense, as many would class it, or whether it works, and then in what manner in which it does. Now, these thoughts are manifold. The first thought, of course, is that it's all a bunch of hocus pocus. If you cast a curse, someone, breaks their leg, gets into a car accident or something, it's coincidence, and that's all it is. Then there's the idea that it's psychological, specifically within a more satanic context. What happens is that a destruction ritual or some other hex or curse is performed, and it affects the psychology of the person casting it, not necessarily the person it's aimed towards. It affects their behavior on a psychological level. They then go out back into the world, and the things that they do hopefully have been altered in such a way that the other person is either damaged in some way, or that the person who performed the curse is uplifted in some way, so that by default, comparing the two, the other person seems to be at a lower status than they were before, essentially to build up the person using the actual curse in some manner. Some people, of course, would say, oh, well, curses and hexes, they work through demonic presences. You would be sending a demon the way of somebody, or some other sort of dark cosmic force or energy or being, in order to sap them of their life force, or cause mayhem in their life, or they get a poltergeist going in their house destroying their dishes, or something of that nature. I've never seen any compelling evidence that in general curses or hexes and things like that, in the more folkish sense. I'm not talking about like summoning demons and the sort of higher ritual aspects of magic. I've never seen compelling evidence that the hexes and curses used in that manner cause a definitive physical effect on the other person that can't be explained by coincidence. However, I do hold absolutely to the belief that if the other person is aware that they have been cursed or hexed, and they have any belief in such things at all, they can often become self-destructive. I also believe that it innately affects the psychology of anyone casting a curse or a hex who believes in it. And subconsciously, to a lesser extent, it still affects them even if they don't, because they've taken it upon themselves to perform a behavior, they've altered their mentality even for a moment. Therefore, their behavior, their whole outlook on life has changed. It's like the idea of power of positive thinking, or a person falling into a self-destructive spiral, where they tell themselves, for instance, they can't do something, and so they can't do it. Not because it's beyond their physical or mental capabilities to do it, but because they've convinced themselves they can't. If they ever get close to achieving it, they typically self-sabotage in order to keep up the cognitive dissonance that they've built in their minds. They do this subconsciously, then they blame themselves or they blame others, and it prevents them from accomplishing much of anything. This is why one of the first steps whenever somebody asks me about spiritual topics, whether it's they want to practice the occult, they want to get into Satanism or something like that, I always tell them the first step is purging guilt and fear. Because if you've got significant guilt and fear that is misplaced, not guilt over legitimate things is one thing. Oh, I killed my mother. Okay. It's okay to feel a bit guilty about that. Don't destroy yourself with that guilt. Yeah, be repentant of it, I suppose. Fear. Well, I'm afraid of bears. Okay, well, I'm not going to tell you that you should go poke the bear in its cave, but at the same time, you should probably take it easy because you're probably never going to encounter one. There are legitimate fears and illegitimate fears. There are legitimate reasons to feel guilty, and there are illegitimate reasons. If you've done something truly monstrous, yes, for at least a time, you should feel guilty for that. And you should try not to do it again, of course, as any sane person would. But if you feel guilty, oh, I masturbated, well, that's a normal human behavior. No, you shouldn't feel guilty for that. And if you do feel guilt for such things, you're holding back your pleasure drive, which is not good for you. This is one of the most fundamental aspects of the occult, at least in the modern variants. Of course, if you're looking at like Renaissance occultism, or medieval occultism, and the rituals performed there, even up to probably the Victorian era, into it, not so much thereafter. Once you get into, the late Victorian, sort of Edwardian period, a lot of the moralism departs from magical systems. It becomes more Easternized in some respects. We're talking about the material of Crowley, the material of Blavatsky, or somebody like that, or it becomes more neo-paganistic. Some of the new stuff that's coming out, it sort of forsakes the Judeo-Christian mythology and the moral token thereof. However, if you go back and you look at hexes or curses or summoning or whatever from those older sources, typically the summoner or the operator or sage or whatever they're termed in the specific work you're dealing with is reminded to be chaste, give praise to the Lord, give alms to the poor, and all of these other things that were seen as part of this general overarching Judeo-Christian ideology. It's as well present within Islam, within the Islamic sort of magical works that I've reviewed, or things that are from Arabic lore. For instance, the Secretorum. Even though it's been Christianized, of course, the God they're talking about is literally Allah. If you look at that, you are reminded, of course, as within the Christian or Jewish traditions of magic, give thanks to this, singular male sort of cosmic entity and so forth, be chaste, don't get too much involved with getting drunk, don't have orgies, don't kill people randomly, don't steal, and treat the poor with respect and so forth. That's been forsaken in many modern diabolical magical systems. Oftentimes people are led to the most diabolical work they can obtain. The problem there, from the perspective of practicing the more legitimate occult, is that generally what you're going to run into are a bunch of charlatans and con artists that have written some little manuscript of black magic that has no actual origin. It's not based on their experimentation, it's just something they hash together, and it's basically a work of fiction when you think about it. The rituals are often very over the top. For instance, the Book of Appen. Now, the original Book of Appen is a grimoire. It's not extant, or not seemingly extant in the world now. Second-hand accounts of this work mention healing sickness, herbal medicine, folk rites, and things of that nature, veterinary practices. It would be a grimoire. In fact, it'd be similar to like a French tradition like the Petit Albert in some of its content. Somebody, though, decided that there should be a diabolical work, and then they attributed it to Vlad the Impaler, and it's essentially a text of extremely chaotic demonolatry, in which the person is supposed to swear their allegiance to the devil, stomp upon the cross, bleed themselves over Christ's image, and do all of these other things. It's very over the top. It's obviously not from Vlad the Impaler. I then wrote my own true Book of Appen, which is more of a standard grimoire. It's still fictional. I admit in the text and on the page for it that it's fictional. I wasn't seeking to make my own do-it-yourself grimoire. I'm being very open about the fact that it's not actually from Vlad. But it's in more of the traditional Orthodox and Judeo-Christian perspective of Renaissance-era magic that would have been used if he had a grimoire to his name. Of course, I was sort of just seeking to subvert this other particular author and his own work. But with hexes and curses, while I don't have specific evidence that you can just perform some little folk rite and it magically destroys your enemy, I do believe it can destroy them psychologically, and I'm open to the concept that they can be destroyed through more cosmic means. If somebody is meditating, focusing their mind constantly, in some of the darker Eastern paths, for example, on destroying a particular person, their actions will follow as well through that. You'd think of the dark meditation cycle of, you'd think of the music of Omenya or something like that. It's all tied together, whether you're talking about an Eastern tradition or a Western tradition. And additionally, in more of these authentic diabolical paths, the goal usually was to drive yourself berserk and then kill your enemy. As in physically, lop their head off, stab them, or poison them, or something of that nature, for the glory of the god you were serving, or the glory of the demon you were venerating at the time. It had nothing to do with simply, in the westernized Victorian tradition especially, I cast the circle, I chanted, I said the invocation, now the demon's loose, going after my enemies. That sort of material is scant in the Renaissance, although present, fairly common in some Enlightenment-era texts, and dies out thereafter, and is replaced by the even easier do-it-yourself mentality of modern occultism, which I see as generally useless. I don't hold to the newer wave traditions of the occult in many cases. Some of it's good. The psychonaut overlap is fine. The certainly advances within herbal medicine and homeopathy and folk rites are just fine. As far as the high ritual aspect of cursing or hexing, I would say that generally, if I'm going to perform anything like that, the text is from the Enlightenment era, sort of the mid-1700s at latest, or possibly into the 19th century. Certainly nothing made within the last 100 years for the most part, except adaptations of Renaissance or medieval texts really does it for me. It's simply my opinion in the way that I work. If somebody were to ask me, I've had people ask me, well, what rituals do you perform? Mostly I don't perform rituals. My reasons for releasing these works and speaking on these topics is one part history, academically speaking, one part interest in folkishness, folk traditions, paganism, things related to that, and only a distant third part would be related to the actual ceremonialism I happen to personally endorse. When I say that I like a text, it doesn't necessarily mean that I've gone through and performed all of these elaborate rituals that they sometimes talk about. What it means is that I've mentally fathomed what they mean on a deeper level. On a metaphoric level, I've peeled back the layers mentally to determine what is actually being said, because if you know anything about, for instance, the Steganographia, like Trithemius, of course, there are layers of understanding that if you don't take everything fully literally, you can peel it back and you can be aware of something new. The Grand Grimoire is the best example of this in all occult literature that I've ever found. The Grand Grimoire is a diabolical work of black magic, as mixed with gray magic, of course, as well, with literal summoning and literal ritualism. But if you read between the lines, it is also a political treatise. That's what I've found. It is a political treatise. Pure Enlightenment era political manuscript, specifically talking about the evils and excesses of monarchs and organized religion. And that's what it is. That's the core message that the enlightened individual who would have been reading it would have gotten. It was distributed to everybody. But depending on what kind of person was reading it, they got a different interpretation thereof. The lowbrow sort of peasant laborer who was half literate who read this said, oh, it's a spell book. I can make the crops grow. I can destroy this lord that was, had first dibs on my wife or something, this feudal figure. The academic or perhaps clerical individual would have read into it that it's a political or a spiritual treatise, that it's not to be taken fully literally. Yeah, maybe they would have dabbled with the ritualism, but it meant something more than that. And I happen to like the Enlightenment for occult literature in general, in a historical sense, best of all eras, because of that interplay, the sort of libertarian, in many ways, quality to some of these works that extends well through the Gilded Age as well. It doesn't simply die out in the 1790s or anything like that. And so that's a little bit about hexes and curses and so forth. Yes, you can practice them at your whim. Of course, some are more effective than others at affecting your own psychology. It is primarily, if your psychology is not aligned properly with your goals, you will never achieve them. You have to believe that you can do them, and you have to take action in order to cause things to culminate. Many people do one or the other, many do neither of them, and that's where they fail. And so hexes and curses, as a stand-in for your own personal effort, don't do anything. You have to have personal responsibility for the things that you do. That being said, they can aid you psychologically, and perhaps they can aid you in a cosmic sense as well. If you, again, it'd be like, casting protective magic. Your friend knows you've cast some protection ritual, maybe it makes them think about that and avoid dangerous situations and think good thoughts, and it makes their life better. Not necessarily because there's a literal, guardian angel on their shoulder watching over them, but because of their awareness of what has been done in a ritual context. That's sort of the more secular but not completely atheistic explanation, anyway, of how such a thing would work. I go beyond that in my own spiritual form. But even an individual who doesn't believe specifically in magic, literally said, has to admit that human psychology is affected, at least in some elements, by such ritualism. That's about all. Peace out.